Welcome to Autism ADHD TV. It is the place to be for parents and professionals. I'm your host, Holly Blanc Moses, the mom psychologist who gets it. We dive into all kinds of important information like behavior, social skills, and learning. All right, let's get started. Welcome, Casey Waugh, back to the Autism ADHD podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You are a regular.
I know, apparently. We've got a standing appointment. We're just going to
keep it. I love it. I love it. So let me introduce you real quick. Casey Waugh is an occupational therapist from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, currently working in an approved private school setting. Casey has worked in a variety of pediatric settings over her 10-year career and specializes in feeding, sensory processing, and prioritizing parent education. Casey also provides individualized supports for parents, focusing on supporting children with sensory differences, as well as navigating the special education process as a master IEP coach. So this is a very important area. Now, I just covered like all these things that you're so good at, but today we're going to talk about specifically the education part. And now that we are going back into the school year, right? So there are often questions about the differences between a 504 and an IEP. And, you know, a lot of my patients, I've got patients have 504s, some have IEPs, but most of them have one of them. Okay, so let's just jump in right away and talk about what is a 504.
Okay, so there are different ways to get supports at school if your child is struggling and needs something to be modified or accommodated in the school environment. So there's a difference between an IEP and a 504, mostly based on any changes that would happen to the actual curriculum that is decided upon and the teacher is teaching. We have what's considered the general education curriculum that everyone in a certain grade is going to be exposed to. So if you have a 504 plan, you are receiving accommodations to the environment, not to that curriculum. So the difference is mainly based on that. An IEP is going to make adjustments to the curriculum to help your student learn or your child learn at their level, whereas a 504, they will still receive that same curriculum that their peers are receiving. However, some differences in the actual classroom environment and potentially how things are presented and how assignments are given. That is the biggest difference on the surface. Accommodations to the environment, not the curriculum, is what you're going to find with the 504 plan.
I like how you made that distinction because it does get a little bit confusing, the difference between the both of them. Sometimes people describe it as a 504 is an IEP light version, but not really. Like they are fundamentally different. So let's talk about some examples of accommodations that someone might find in a 504.
Sure. So and the one thing I want to say as well is anything that you can find in a 504 is going to be in an IEP. Like anything that is in a 504 will be written somewhere into an IEP. So there are some instances when a child would have both. It's not very common, but if let's say like a child has a need for an IEP for specialized education, but then they also have a medical condition such as diabetes or asthma or something that is more medically based, they may have both. But that's not the norm, and you don't need to have a 504 and an IEP to get these accommodations. So just want to put that out there because that could be confusing too. Parents are like, well, I don't have a 504 and I need these accommodations. Everything that's in a 504 can and will be included in an IEP. So some of the things that you can see as far as accommodations go are things like differential seating in a classroom. So really pinpointing where the best place is for the child to sit. There could be changes in where and when a child takes a test. It could be changes to the lighting or the sound in a classroom for testing or just in general. There could be accommodations to the way that notes are taken. There could be changes to how an assignment is given, like broken down into chunks, or we're going to have check-ins every so often, or we're going to have somebody else take the notes for you while you're practicing that, but you're still going to get that information. It might be reducing how many homework questions you have to do. Maybe you only have to do 50% of the homework assignment to prove that you're actually getting that practice. So there are changes to the actual physical environment, like seating, or the way that the information is presented. We're not changing the information, we're just changing how it is presented or how it may be graded by the amount that you actually have to produce. So it can vary a lot.
Right. And I think that is really important because we can make those changes based on, again, like every child is different. They're going to need something different. But for another example, maybe a teacher thinks for their classroom, it's best that kids don't have fidgets because they find them distracting. Well, maybe there's a child with ADHD or who is autistic who needs that stimulation for their hand or needs some sort of way to possibly have a chew necklace or some sort of fidget that's quiet, that's not distracting for the class. That could be written into the 504, all because it's a classroom sort of rule for that teacher doesn't mean that that can't be an accommodation for that student. And I think sometimes students get confused, which is it is confusing because there can be a difference between those things. And they might not know that they can have those things that they need, especially too with you mentioned seating. Where does that work best? Some students really do well when they're up front by the teacher. They can hear better, they can concentrate, they're less distracted by other things that are going on in the classroom. And some other children, maybe being away from the window works best for them because they're not distracted by kind of looking at it, or maybe being away from the door because they can hear the other sounds in the hallway. So there's so many things to think about, but also the type of seating, right, is important. Maybe, for instance, like one of my patients really needs to have a stool instead of a chair, or maybe another student needs to sit on a ball, so really thinking about the type of seating available, I think is important too.
Right. And I think that an important thing you mentioned there is that we have these plans because this is what this child needs. It's not a decision by like each individual teacher. When something like this is written up, this follows them from classroom to classroom. And something like a stool, for example, we need to figure out, okay, does that mean we need to buy a stool for each classroom, or is this kid supposed to like carry his stool from?
You don't want them carrying it.
No, no. And also these accommodations should not be based on whether the child asks for them. Sometimes we'll have things like the child will have access to a fidget if they ask for it. But in my experience as an OT, when a kid needs sensory supports, like we need to be proactive about that, not waiting for them to need it. The whole purpose of it is to prevent or to provide them with the stimulation they need so that they are more able to participate. So if there is something in there that's like the student needs to ask for their notes, we have that accommodation that they need help with notes because they need help with notes. Like it should not be reliant on a student asking for their accommodations.
Casey, I'm going to take a billboard out for what you just said. Because that comes up so often is upon request or the student asks. We need to think about what that means when we're writing up those words, because that is not okay.
Right.
It may sound okay. Right. It may sound okay, but it's not, because usually students are, they may be distracted. They may not be thinking about this is an option for me, or do I even need this in that moment?
Right.
And also, asking for something different than the other kids in front of the kids. I mean, that's really hard. A lot of kids don't want to ask because, first of all, communication is difficult and it's anxiety provoking.
Right. Right. And it's one of those things that's like, if there's a check-in, check-out type of thing, and if the student doesn't take their paper up to the teacher, then like sometimes then they'll say, well, you didn't get it. So now I'm not going to do your checkout. And then that like can cause a waterfall for the rest of the day because maybe they're getting check marks or maybe they're, it's like whatever the plan is in place should not be reliant on the student's shoulders to make it out. I mean, there's value in learning how to advocate for yourself, but we need to scaffold the supports around where we are now so that in the future, maybe they can. But that happens a lot. We see, student has to request it. We'll get a break when they ask. And oftentimes it's like past the point of no return. And we're like, well, you didn't ask for a break. Well, they might need help recognizing that they need a break. So those kinds of things, just be aware that that can be written in as well. And if there's questions of whether a teacher will or will not follow through with that, then that's something to talk about as well. How are we going to keep people accountable and who's going to be making sure that this is being implemented? Because that's not as structured as it is in an IEP. 504s can look very different from school to school, district to district, because there's not as much guidance, because 504s originated from a civil rights law. It's not an educational law. So they are kind of like, each district can kind of have their own format. Some schools don't even write them down, which is crazy to me, but you very much can and should ask for who's going to be doing these accommodations, who's going to be like your point person to make sure that they're actually happening, and what's your communication plan, and how will you know if these things are working or not?
Well, and yes to all of those things. I should have a sign. Yes to everything you just said. And so this is the deal that we need to be really clear on the who. And I think that's where a lot of 504s fall short, is there's not a point person. They're not taking down information to see if it's working. And it's hard to kind of figure out when it is if the goals aren't very specific, right? So, there are a lot of things that come into that. And I think that, when teachers are understanding what a 504 is, the parents are understanding, the child, we want to support them. And again, going back and 100 times over, that should not fall on the student, because if you see a gap and you're saying, well, they're not asking, well, then they're not able to ask yet. And if they're not able to ask yet, that's our job.
Right.
That becomes our job to support them. So I love that we were talking about that and breaking down those differences and accommodations you might see in a 504. So let's talk about the IEP then.
Sure. So the IEP document is, like I said, it includes anything that could be in a 504, those accommodations. But the thing that holds an IEP apart is the specially designed instruction, or SDI. There's so many acronyms in special education, but that specially designed instruction is what is making those changes to the actual curriculum to help your student be successful. Now, IEPs are, the whole goal of them is to prepare students for further education, future employment, and independent living. Like, that is what an IEP is meant to do. So it's not only academic. So that includes things like social skills and behavior, and the entire school environment. We're not just talking about the time spent on math and reading. It can really encompass the entire experience of a child at school. So the IEP is more structured because it is an educational law that governs everybody in the entire country who gets federal funding to have special education. So the IEP has very specific things that must be included in that document, which is why, there's more accountability written into an IEP. Not that you can't ask for that in a 504, you just might have to ask for it because it's not a given. There are very specific goals that are written in an IEP. There has to be data tracking. So there's a lot more structure and accountability written right into that document, which is a legally binding document, providing that student with what they need to access their education.
Definitely. And that is different. So like you said, everything in a 504 can be in an IEP.
Yes.
And you may even start out with your child or the student having a 504 and they move into an IEP. That's also possible. I've also seen it go the other direction where they had an IEP, they're doing really well. They're, the teacher, the parents, the child are feeling like, oh, maybe we don't need that level of support. Maybe we can go to a 504. So it really is about what the child needs and when.
Right. And when there is also a difference in how the evaluation is done. An evaluation, a full special education evaluation is going to include a whole team of people, and they're going to look at how a child's disability impacts their learning. So we're looking at everything. We're doing a lot of observation and standardized assessments. And that may or may not be the case with a 504 plan. Again, some school districts have a very similar policy, and you can ask for that. If you're not sure what their policy is, you can ask for it. It should be somewhere in writing to let you know what your steps are. But the full evaluation for special education is going to look at the big picture. Where do we have needs, and how will we then support those specific needs in academics and behavior and social skills and that whole piece. So that might be including somebody like me, an OT, PT, speech, psychology, vision therapist, audiology. All of those things can come into play to help support a student with an IEP. Sometimes you can get something like OT with a 504, but it's not a given. Some schools do not provide related services for 504s because they don't have to, and they don't get any funding support for that. Some schools set money aside to help 504 kids, but that's not a given as well. So if that's something your child needs, that may indicate, okay, we need an IEP to get those services.
Right. And there really is, like you were saying, a difference in service, yes. From specialized service, pulling out for services, again, like I said, changing in curriculum, whatever that looks like for them. So then we have, categories of eligibility, like you said, intensive, the differences between the assessment from a 504 and an IEP. And, again, like you said, it could involve OTs and speech and vision and all those things, because we want to make sure that we get all the pieces and what that child needs. So, there are really big differences between those two.
Yes. And you mentioned the eligibility with either plan. You are saying your child has a disability of some kind. That is what these plans are for. 504 plans, the definition is for any disability that impacts I forget what the exact wording is, but it's any disability. There's not any specific category or anything like that. With an IEP, there's a difference between an educational diagnosis or category and one that you would get from a medical professional. The school's not going to diagnose you with anything. They can't do that. They cannot give you a medical diagnosis. That comes from a physician or a psychiatrist, psychologist, wherever you're getting a medical professional to diagnose you. A school will categorize your disability into certain sections. And it's important to note as well that category should not indicate what supports you get. It's really just putting you into a category to say this is where our biggest needs are. But that does not mean that you're limited to only you can only get OT if you have this disability category. It's kind of like, where are we going to categorize this disability? But the plan is still individualized. So sometimes you'll hear, oh, ADHD, you can't get an IEP because it's not one of those disability categories. Well, that's not true. There, you know, if you have ADHD, whether it's medically diagnosed or sometimes they'll say is showing symptoms similar to ADHD and not even have that medical diagnosis, it does not preclude you or exclude you from having an IEP. That could fit under OHI, which is a category of other health impairment. So it does get confusing. There is a difference in those disability names, but the school is not going to give you a medical diagnosis. I think that's important to note as well.
I think that's really important too, because that's where it gets confusing. You can have an evaluation from the school and they may determine that there are signs that may show autism, for example, but they're not diagnosing your child with autism, or they're not diagnosing your child with ADHD. That needs to come from outside the school. And like you said, that could be a psychiatrist, it could be a physician, it could be a psychologist. So when someone comes to my office and they say, you know, Holly, you know, I think my child might be autistic, I'm interested in evaluation. I do that, which would be considered medical, even though I'm not a physician, but I'm a psychologist. So the parent can take my evaluation back to the school and sit down and say, we just had an outside evaluation. Our child is diagnosed with autism. We want to give you this report and come together and collaborate on how we can get them those needed support. So the team at the school can come together and say, let's look at this evaluation and see if it meets the criteria for school. And if it does, we are going to put them for eligibility for an IEP under the category of autism. And then we're going to come together and build that IEP around that child's individual needs. Now, sometimes, depending on the school's checklist, they'll do an additional evaluation or do their own evaluation in addition to the medical evaluation. So it really does depend on that school and that team.
And I'd say it's probably, depending on where you are in the country, that's going to say, like some school districts are going to say, yeah, we're definitely doing our own. Even if you go from a neighboring school district to a different one, they may want to do their own full evaluation on their own, or they may take the outside information. The one thing that can be, you know, frustrating for parents is if you get that full evaluation outside of the school and the school says, like, they don't legally have to follow what's in that evaluation. They have to consider it. That's what's written in the law. They have to consider outside information, but they don't have to do any of the recommendations that are written in there. So that's where that like really important piece of communication and ensuring that you are open and really making sure that everybody is working as a team and it's not like us against them kind of thing. So that it can be very helpful to have both the outside information and the school evaluation, because then you get, you know, you're getting views from different settings, which again gives you the whole picture of the child. Like when they come to you, Holly, you get more information about home life and community life, and you're asking about like the whole picture of the child, whereas the school is focusing more on school. So having both of those pieces together can create a really awesome plan.
Yeah, and I will say, side note, parents looking for evaluations, this is just my soapbox here for a second. Psychologists, please interview teachers. Please do that. That's, you know, like you said, that is another big part of that child's life. So we want to make sure when you're doing an outside evaluation, I like to interview at least one teacher, usually 2 to 3 school personnel when I'm doing an evaluation for a child, because again, that's so important and it's going to play a part in my recommendations. Okay, so I'm off my soapbox now. But yeah, I'm glad that we're talking about those differences, because an educational diagnosis is not the same as a medical diagnosis. It is absolutely not. And so I think that gets really confusing. And so I'm glad that we're talking about that.
Right. Yeah.
In addition to that, if a school does an evaluation and the parent thinks, I'm not sure, this doesn't seem right to me, they can ask for an independent evaluation and have the school foot the bill for that. So let's talk about that first.
Sure. So if you have your child evaluated for a school special education evaluation, and for whatever reason you feel that that evaluation is not complete, they don't get all of the information that could have been available. Maybe they didn't have speech or OT evaluate when there is a noted need in one of those two areas, or perhaps there was only observation in one class and they said they did great in that class. We don't see any behavior issues, no problems. So for whatever reason, it is not a complete or appropriate evaluation. You have a right as a parent to request an IEE or independent educational evaluation. You kind of have to have proof that their evaluation is not sufficient, though. You can't just say, I don't agree with the results. Because there may be, we know kids, things are different in different settings. So what we see at home could be very different from school. That's not saying that the school doesn't have to help or anything, but just because you disagree with an evaluation doesn't necessarily mean that it is incorrect. But if it is not complete or sufficient, you need to have some kind of proof or evidence that that is true. And then the school can then pay for an outside educational evaluation by a neuropsychologist or somebody else who does those types of evaluations. And then again, that report would go back to the school. They have to consider it, but again, they don't have to take those recommendations. And this is where it can be like, we're getting kind of like we're on rocky road. Are we going towards the route of like a state complaint, or are we going to go to court? Hopefully not. But that is a right that parents have to ask for an outside evaluation if the one the school does is not sufficient.
And I'm glad that we're covering that, because I talk a lot to parents and they were unaware that that was an option. And so I think that, as informed as we can possibly be, that's always a great thing. And again, hopefully that wouldn't happen, but it's just good to know that that is an option. It's something that you can ask for. So if we were going to go down a specific route, when we're talking about a school doing an evaluation, perhaps an occupational therapist does an evaluation and they come back with a recommendation to the team that child does not need occupational therapy, but then a parent is really worried about this handwriting. And they have these samples of handwriting that it's really difficult for them to read. The child is, having a lot of anxiety or stress around handwriting, trying to avoid handwriting. So those are some things that's kind of that documentation I think that you're talking about too, is okay, I'm disagreeing with what's coming back with this evaluation and the recommendations. I really feel like my child does need this.
Right. And in those kinds of situations too, it's, again, going back to the conversations, if somebody says to you someone from the school team says to you as a parent, we can't do that, or we don't do that here. Sometimes we'll hear that when they say that OTs in school only work on handwriting and they're like not addressing sensory needs at all, which is not true. But sometimes that is what, maybe administration isn't as informed on what OT actually does, or maybe, that's a whole other thing. But if there is somebody telling you we don't do that or we can't do that, as the parent, your response to that is like, show me that in writing, show me your written policy that says that you cannot or will not do that. Because if it exists, they'll produce it for you and you'll say, okay, fine, we cannot or will not do that. But a lot of times those statements are not backed by any district policy or anything like that. Like OT only sees a kid on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Like that is not a written policy that is anywhere. If that doesn't work for that individual child, then like those kinds of things can be, we assume that the school is going to tell us all of our rights and information, and they're not necessarily going to do that. So knowing, your rights as a parent and just saying, okay, if you have questions, show me that in writing. That will get you pretty far.
I love the show me in writing. And I have, people like to hear my personal stories sometimes on here.
Yeah.
And when my child was in need of a one-on-one assistant to be with him throughout the day, I was told in an IEP meeting, we don't do that. So if I was not informed, I would have just taken that, right? As they don't provide that service. But then I said, okay, so show me that in writing. Show me the policy where he's not able to access something he needs. And again, I don't think this person who said that was the school personnel person who said that was coming from a malicious standpoint. I don't think it was that at all. I think it was misinformation. So even though, it took a while, he does have a full-time assistant, with him during the school day. So even when someone says we don't do that, like you said, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. It just means that you're going to be looking at more information, requesting more information. And then, of course, before we jump off, we want to talk about an IEP coach and what that can do for you, because it can be overwhelming as a parent and a teacher too. I mean, teachers have 100 million things to do. So even though I have been working with kids with ADHD and kids that are autistic for 23 years, I still have an IEP coach come with me to my child's meetings. I still do, because I might miss something. There might be something they thought of that I didn't. And it's emotional, right? Like these meetings aren't so easy. As a parent, this is your baby. You want to do everything you can to support them in school. And it's just really nice to have somebody there who is familiar with the rights, familiar with your child's rights, to be there with you.
Right. Yeah. So there are different ways that you can get support. I mean, even if you have a meeting tomorrow and you don't have anybody to come with you, like, please don't go to meetings alone. At least ask if your partner can come with you, or if you have a close friend. In the law, it says that parents can bring, like, anyone who has a close relationship to the child, like, they have to have an interest in what is going on. But I've had, parents can bring their parent, maybe a grandparent is coming, a friend, a sister, having somebody there to be a support person. But if you are in need of more support as far as like the actual meeting and understanding what's happening and making sure your point is made clearly and that you understand what they're saying, IEP coaches support parents in that, in helping to create a plan that works for your child and keeping communication open. There are also educational advocates that have more of a legal background. Like, I'm not a lawyer. I will not give legal advice. So if you are looking to like file complaints or go to due process, I'm not your girl. That would come from a lawyer and an educational advocate. So the difference here is that my support comes mainly for the parent in preparing for the meetings, making sure that your communication is clear and that you're understanding what the team is telling you, that the plan is working for your child. But there are IEP coaches across the country, and there are agencies also in every state that provide parent education. Every state has at least one parent training information center. You can Google where it is. It may not be close to you, but they provide a lot of great resources online. And I've also found that universities who have law schools, sometimes they will provide free support to parents for educational advocacy. So there are a lot of ways to get help. Don't go to meetings alone.
I love that. And most of you know that I practice within Raleigh, North Carolina. And Casey, you're in Pittsburgh, where I just was last week.
Yeah.
So what I will also do, because we do have a large audience from North Carolina, I am going to post a link below that will specifically take you to those free resources like that you, Casey, were just talking about that we have access to, and it's lovely. So I'll make sure to do that as well. But again, it's in every state. Google it. It's pretty easy to find. Again, those in North Carolina, because I'm not most familiar with this area, I will make sure that's down there for you. Awesome. Thank you so much, Casey. As usual, you are our go-to OT for the Autism ADHD podcast. I just love that so much. And I'm sure we'll be talking again on another topic.
Yeah, call me up. I'm here.
And everybody make sure below, I'm going to have Casey's information. She has the most fun, engaging social media about more than anybody I know in this space. Like, she's amazing. So don't miss out. She's got lots of great resources for you. And I will have that in a link in the show notes for you too.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, Casey, thanks so much, and see you soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like this episode, please share it with someone. It may just be what they need to watch today. If you're a parent, I'd love if you came on over and joined our Facebook group, Autism ADHD Group for Parents. If you're a therapist or educator, come on over to our group, Autism ADHD Group for Therapists and Educators. You're going to find those links right down there in the notes. Thanks so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.
All content provided is protected under applicable copyright, patent, trademark, and other proprietary rights. All content is provided for informational and educational purposes only. No content is intended to be a substitute for professional medical or psychological diagnosis, advice, or treatment. Information provided does not create an agreement for service between Holly Blanc Moses, Crossvine Clinical Group, the interviewee, Holly Blanc Moses LLC, and the recipient. Consult your physician regarding the applicability of any opinions or recommendations with respect to your symptoms or medical condition, or the symptoms or medical condition of your family member. Children or adults who show signs of dangerous behavior toward themselves and/or others should be placed immediately under the care of a qualified professional.